Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for being here today. My name is Rachel Samson, and I am the Vice President of Research at the Institute for Research on Public Policy, or the IRPP. Before we begin, let's take a moment to recognize and reflect on the fact that we are gathered on the unceded traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose members we recognize as custodians of these lands since time immemorial. This area has long been a gathering place for Indigenous peoples. We honor their enduring connection to this land. In our work as a think tank researching government policies that can improve the lives of current and future generations in Canada, we recognize that many policies have been and still are a source of harm to Indigenous peoples across the country. The IRPP is working to mobilize the knowledge, experiences, and voices of Indigenous peoples through dedicated research, fellowships, and publications related to Indigenous realities and directly involving Indigenous peoples. We urge everyone joining us today to do what they can personally and professionally to further their own understanding of local Indigenous communities. Today, we are here to discuss how to leverage digital technologies to achieve more equitable, efficient, and effective public transportation in Canada. In addition to our panel discussion, the IRPP also published a comprehensive paper by Ada Khan, an emeritus professor in transportation engineering at Carleton University, and Ren Thomas, an associate professor in the School of Planning at Dalhousie University. You can find the paper on our website at irpp.org. There are also some copies on the tables in the room and out front. The authors were unfortunately unable to join us in person today, but I believe Professor Khan is watching the conversation online. Today's event is our second in a three-part series, Imagining a Better Digital Future for Canada, sponsored by TELUS. I'm now going to introduce our three expert panelists. Shauna Brail is an associate professor and director of the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto Mississauga, and holds a cross-appointment at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. As an economic geographer and urban planner, Professor Brail's research focuses on the transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. Jean-Sébastien Langelier is the Executive Director of Public Transit Policy at Infrastructure Canada. Jean-Sébastien is the lead on transit policy for the federal government and has led the development of the approach to Canada's permanent public transit funding. Catherine McKenney is the co-founder of CitySHAPES, a national nonprofit organization working to make cities better for everyone, and a consultant with others who share these common goals. Catherine is also a former two-term Ottawa City Councillor. For those in the audience today, I want to give a heads up that we will provide the opportunity for those in the room and those online to pose questions to our panelists at the end of our discussion. Let's get started. Okay, to start us off, I want to look 20 to 25 years into the future. If we were to imagine an ideal urban transportation system, what would it look like? Not just in terms of technology, but in terms of the experience for public transit users. Catherine, I'm going to start with you. How would you envision the ideal city in terms of urban transportation and public transit? How would it be different than the cities we have today?
I think, first off, moving around your city by either transit or active transportation would have to be easier, more efficient than driving. We've built our cities to make driving the primary mode of mobility. So, when I think about, the future, when I think about today and into the future, I want to be able to live in a place where I can walk to shops, I can walk to school, I can walk to a library, but also I can take a bike if I want to. I can cycle in good, safe infrastructure. If I decide I want to take transit, I want to be able to see, using a simple phone, if that's still what we're using in 25 years from now. But I want to see, when the bus is arriving. I want to know when that train is coming. I want to be able to get to that train if it's, more than a 5 or 10 minute walk by bike or by electric scooter, to have that kind of shared mobility and connectedness. And when I get off of the bus, I want to be able to pick up, an electric bike or an electric scooter, or be able to walk because it's a dense area with mixed use. So, and it needs to all be connected, simply with that kind of one app, if you will. I want to be able to, somebody's calling me, sorry. I'm not going to take it. I'll turn that off. I want to be able to take it easy, and I want to get there, and because we all make those very quick decisions every day, I believe, whenever we step out of our home in terms of how we're going to get somewhere.
So it's not necessarily the technology, it's the smooth interaction between.
And the technology helps, of course, but it's that smoothness to getting from A to B. Yeah.
Shauna, what role do you see technology playing in transforming urban transportation? Can digital technologies help to achieve some of the outcomes that Catherine mentioned?
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, and they absolutely can. I think that Catherine describes a very compelling future focused on accessible, affordable, excellent transit services, active transportation and mobility. It's not a future that everybody desires, though, and I think it's actually really important to acknowledge that in any conversation, that there are people for whom efforts to move away from private automobiles are both threatening and create great division. How can digital technologies help us in this transformation, in this very much needed transformation, if we are to continue to be able to live on this planet, to be able to have cities that are functional, that have strong economies, that support people. And so thinking about the role of digital technologies actually enables transit and other forms of transportation to work more quickly, to perhaps rival the opportunities of a private automobile and the comfort of a private automobile, whether it's in terms of trip planning, whether it's in terms of actually making it more desirable because of the type of urban form that we develop, and creating a connected and smart system, using technology, but also prioritizing people at the core, I think goes to the heart of that.
Thank you. Jean-Sébastien, Canada's 2050 net zero goal for greenhouse gas emissions will require some major changes. What will urban transportation systems look like in 2050 if Canada achieves that goal?
Yes. So I think there are two key elements to that change that would be necessary. The first one is the concrete electrification of the transportation system and transit agencies in the first place. Right now we have 98% of for example the bus fleets in Canada that are still powered by carbon intensive sources of energy. And that shift is going to require significant resources and investments in order to have a net zero fleet and net zero operations of public transit services. And of course, that doesn't happen in itself in a vacuum. There are also investments that need to be made in the grid, the energy grid, so that there are a lot of other investments that are broader than just in the transportation system. I'd say the other change that we will want to see is an increase in the use of sustainable transportation modes. And I'm thinking obviously active transportation and public transit, and understanding what are the current barriers for these modes of transportation, and making sure that people have options in terms of transportation when they want to access jobs, when they want to access services, healthcare, in their daily lives.
So 2050 seems far away, but transforming urban transportation is going to take time, and many of the decisions taken today about infrastructure, where new housing is built, those all play a significant role in achieving that vision that we were talking about. So let's talk more about those problems Jean-Sébastien raised. Shauna, I know you have a book coming out later this year, and that looks at the impact of the pandemic and smartphones and climate change on urban mobility. Can you talk about some of the implications of these major changes for public transit systems?
Yes, definitely. And thank you for mentioning our book. I have nominated myself as the Chief Marketing Officer of the book. You can pre-order it now on U of T Press and on Amazon. It's called Urban Mobility: How the iPhone, COVID, and Climate Changed Everything. And I credit the title to my co-editor, Professor Betsy Donald at Queen's University, who I have worked with on this project for many years now. But we essentially, in this book, and sort of thinking about the impact of these disruptions, of the disruption of technology, and especially the iPhone, and what we call the digital trifecta of the iPhone reaching sort of mass levels of adoption, the introduction of cloud computing that allowed access to data from anywhere, and the addition of GPS on phones enabled huge changes in how people move around, resulted in the emergence in many ways of what I call ride-hailing, what you might call Uber or Lyft, but also changes in how we take public transport, changes in terms of the ability for me, for instance, to arrive at the airport today, open my phone, click on the map, say, how do I get to the Delta City Centre hotel? By car, by walking, and by transit. I didn't really look at the walking part, but I can tell you that by transit was actually, at the time that I arrived, only about 10 or 12 minutes longer than by private automobile, which is pretty great by many standards. And so the sort of emergence of the phone, the adoption of the phone, and the connection, that trifecta of those three things made a huge difference. But then we also had COVID, which, as everybody in the room knows, was incredibly disruptive and decimated transit activity, cost cities in Canada billions upon billions of dollars in lost ridership revenues and fares, and is only just beginning to approach pre-pandemic levels. In some places like Mississauga, which is a bus-centric transit system, they have recovered entirely. They are beyond pre-pandemic rates. In Toronto, we're at about 78%. In Ottawa, I looked it up here, the last figure I could see was you're at about 66%. There's a lot of work to be done. It doesn't mean we should stop investing in transit, though. And then the last thing is climate, which is actually a good reason to continue to invest in transit, to think about the sustainability of the system, approaching our goal for net zero, and thinking about how to create livable cities. Public transit is very much a part of that. So.
Jean-Sébastien, you have a national lens on this challenge. What do you see as some of the major challenges in achieving that ideal transportation vision?
I think, yes, there are challenges, but also many, regions, urban areas, cities are really in a good place also to address those challenges. I'd say, and that will not necessarily come as a surprise, but there might be some issues related to like the longer term planning when it comes to transportation. I think there is often some longer term plans in different regions. At the same time, those plans are not always followed. There's also, in terms of how do we make sure that we are looking at what are the major transit projects that we invest in. We've seen some issues with, how can we actually put those projects, in the ground, making sure that they are working. We've seen some delays in some instances. So I think the issue, that all goes back to the issue of, how can we increase our capacity to better plan projects? And that comes back, more broadly in terms of planning. It's more than just planning about an individual project. It's also about thinking more broadly about, how do we plan our cities? What is the thinking around, the vision for the urban community? And then, looking at what are the housing needs, for example, and how, you do the land use planning, and then how does that all integrate into a broader vision? So essentially, I'd say that's probably one areas where, if we are successful in this will really help our chances in order to move forward.
Catherine, one of the things that comes up often when we talk about investing in public transit or bicycle lane infrastructure is the cost. What are people missing when they talk about these costs?
Well, I think there's, I think that what we don't explain well is, this kind of price versus cost, and the price of something, can be, can certainly not equal the overall cost. And when we think about cities, especially municipalities, I always start by recognizing that municipalities, while they're responsible for most of our infrastructure, their revenue, the revenue generation is through only property taxes, and there's about 10 cents off of every dollar that comes to municipalities, although they're on the front lines of many things: housing, homelessness, transit. But when we think about the costs, say, for healthy cycling infrastructure, like, budgets really are about priorities. So, when we think about a city and investing in say, a good cycling infrastructure, we could spend $250 million in the next 4 years and have a great cycling infrastructure in this city, or we can widen the road for $200 million. And those are things that we do. We have trade-offs, if you will, because money is finite. People, especially in cities. But when you think about the cost, for safety, equity, certainly for people who can't drive or choose not to drive, certainly just the cost to your infrastructure, maintaining your infrastructure. And if we look into the future, a city like Ottawa is likely going to grow by about 40%. Well, you cannot put 40% more traffic on our roads. You won't be able to move. So we do have to get people onto other modes of transportation, onto transit, into cycling, into cycling. And I'll just say this: I believe that in the next 20 years, the number of people purchasing e-bikes is going to transform, and it's how we build our cycling infrastructure, because people are going to demand better infrastructure who aren't there today. I think it's a whole new demographic that we're going to see coming on. I just bought my first e-bike, by the way, and I'm a huge cyclist. I cycle year-round. I have my whole life, but e-bike, that new e-bike I just got, is changing how I move around the city. So I think it's coming.
And can you, just following up on that, can you speak a little bit about the connection with housing? Decisions on housing, absolutely. And it's not just about investing in the bicycle infrastructure or the public transit infrastructure, where we put housing.
So in cities, generally, what we've done is we've either built up or built out. And we can't continue to do both. We can build up, but we know that 70% of people don't want to live in towers. 30 do, and for the 30% that do, it's great. But we can't keep building out. So we can build in, and we can build in a way that is sustainable. We have land that can be used for building in. We've got neighborhoods that we can densify in a gentle way without changing the streetscape, but we can double the density of many of our neighborhoods, especially when you think about that. I call them the bungalow belt, if you will, but those kind of pre-1980 neighborhoods where you've got, smaller homes on larger lots. We can build those so that they are a bit denser. They're usually transit serviceable. They become more walkable. We bring in more mixed use so that people can stay within their neighborhoods and move about in their neighborhoods. When we think about places where we like to visit, I always say, think about a place that you want to go and visit. It's not usually a place that's, unless you're hiking, if you're going to a city, you want to go to a city that's walkable, that's transit serviceable, that's dense, that's interesting to walk, up and down, around the neighborhood. So those are the types of neighborhoods that we have to start to think about and start building. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but certainly as we densify, those amenities, those services will come into those neighborhoods.
I wonder if I could just add on, because one of the simplest policy levers in order to make housing more affordable is actually to reduce how much parking spaces you provide, right? Yeah, and so thinking about making transit-friendlier neighborhoods that are more connected, that are even a little bit more dense, but not necessarily as dense as what we see out the window. Every parking spot at the surface level costs $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 plus the land cost, and an an underground garage type space can cost close to $100,000. So just by removing the parking, you're making those homes more affordable for the people who need to live in them.
And Shauna, building on that, so the Kahn-Thomas paper highlights the disconnect across different departments in government that leads to decisions sometimes that work at cross purposes and potentially encouraging urban sprawl. Can you talk about some of the challenges in navigating all the different decision-making bodies?
Yes, I want to start by saying that I love this question and this theme around silos, and we have to get rid of silos. I want to say that this is an evergreen theme. I worked for the provincial government in Ontario in the early 2000s, and we had a huge campaign. We were getting rid of all silos in the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade, and I can assure you that those silos still exist in 2024, or maybe new ones. But at the same time, we need to address the challenges around collaboration and communication, around how do we get units to work together, right? How do we get the engineers to speak with the urban planners, to speak with social services and employment planning? And it's really hard, it's really complex. If it were easy, we would have done it already. And at the same time, there's another layer of complexity on there, which I think is also touched upon nicely in the report, that emphasizes the role of not just of municipalities or not just even of governments, but of private sector partners, of community, of thinking about the entire ecosystem that needs to be involved. And again, it's very, very complex to think about how do you do this, right? How do you implement and how do you create the tools? We know that by having, conversations, generating new knowledge and research, having even, case hacking competitions, that we can innovate, that we can think of new ways, and we need to test things out, right? We should be less afraid of failing and more afraid of not trying. And so just because we haven't solved the silo problem yet doesn't mean we shouldn't keep working on it.
And Jean-Sébastien, you, as working in the federal government, you often look at what other countries are doing or potentially cities around the world. How do you see Canada positioned in that realm? Are our cities keeping up with some of the leading approaches out there? Yeah,
so if we think in terms of like public transit and how, are people actually using it, and we look at across the world, if you look at other North American countries, we are doing pretty well in terms of like just the amount of people using transit. We're talking about a modal share around 25% for big cities, and which is comparable to some cities in Europe, like if you look at Madrid, Berlin. So I think we have comparable use of our transit systems. Having said that, each city is particular. There are some differences in terms of geography that we need to take into account. So I'd say we're starting from a very good place. In terms of other good practices that could inspire how we do things, there are interesting cases in how people are actually integrating considerations like climate into planning. I'm thinking, for example, in California, there was a requirement that regions actually look at, within their modeling, when they do the modeling for the transportation system, how is the transportation investments are going to reduce the GHGs over time, looking at the overall impact of the transportation system. So you can see that there are some innovations in how we are using the data in order to better understand different scenarios of different investments that you can make, and then at the end of the day, the different impact that they can have.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the Con Thomas paper as well is that the difference between cities with over 500,000 people and cities with less than 500,000 people, that the large cities might be doing fairly well, but some of the smaller cities, I think, are perhaps struggling a bit more. Can you say more about that, Jean-Sébastien?
Yes, and at the same time, I think we should not necessarily use the same criteria to compare them, because some cities, have been with low density, have been built on large distances, and maybe the type of solutions that we have in large urban areas are just not going to be the same. Like you can have, and the paper talks about the kind of micro mobility services, where you have smaller scale, on-demand transit that could be the solution that is actually appropriate for those communities. So.
Catherine, I want to turn to equity considerations. In your view, who is being left behind in our current approach to urban transportation? How is the system failing them?
Well, I think a lot of people are being left behind. Back to Shauna's point about parking, and look at people who live in tall buildings, and that cost is passed on to them. So the alternative right now is to live outside of the core, and then the only available option to you often is driving, and that leaves people behind. It leaves people with mobility challenges behind. It leaves people with low incomes behind. It leaves seniors behind. At some point in all of our lives, we won't be able to drive. So people do get left behind, just in terms of our land use and our how we plan for transportation and land use. Certainly, in terms of costs of transit in price of transit for individuals, we hear it all the time, where families just cannot afford to move around by transit. We know who takes transit. We know where they take transit. Our transit systems have historically in larger cities been built as for commuter for commuting. That has changed, post-COVID, obviously, and so if we want to build equity in our cities, we've got to make sure that people can afford transit, and that doesn't mean one cutoff at one certain number where you get a low-income pass. You have to have a serious sliding scale. There have got to be some people who do not pay for transit. And we also have to make sure that we don't put our transit systems in a death spiral, because it's easy to do. Budgets again are constrained, but if you have low ridership and your ridership is decreasing, you cannot cut your transit system. You can't continue to cut, and it happens far too often. We in Ottawa in 2010, we had what was called route optimization, where routes changed and were cut, and we had a decreasing ridership every year since. So people who get left behind then are not the commuters. They are not the people who have access to other ways of moving around, but those who don't. And it's often people in lower income neighborhoods and people in suburban neighborhoods who are lower income as well, that have to have a way of not just getting into the city, but getting around their neighborhoods, whether it's to do groceries, whether it's to take their kids to school or to a library, especially when there's no other way.
It seems like so much of the public transit discussion or even transportation discussion is about commuters, and this idea of living in a potentially suburban neighborhood and commuting to a city center. How do you see that? How should we think differently going forward?
Mm-hmm. We really need to think about transit as serving people where they need to go. And, obviously sensitivity around data collection and data, but we as cities have got to understand origin and destination. We have to understand where people are, where they're traveling to, and we've not done a particularly good job of that for any of our mobility or active transportation, whether it's cycling, whether it's better sidewalks, wider sidewalks, or whether it's transit. And so to understand, where people are, how they're using transit, who is using transit, and to make sure that we have, instead of this one large hub and spoke type of transit system, that we have all these little mini hubs, and that you can, if you live in a suburban community, you can actually, I live downtown. I think that for the most part, I could probably get around by transit, but I don't, because it's too expensive, so I just don't, because I often consider the cost and think, well, I think I'll just walk. But if you don't have that option and you live in a suburban community, you should be able to get around your community by transit.
So let's turn to the role of digital technologies in helping to make things better. The Kant Thomas paper talks about leveraging digital technologies for more equitable, efficient, and effective public transportation. When I think of digital technologies, I'm thinking of transit apps or smartphones, smart traffic management systems that prioritize buses. But the authors also provide a much longer list of opportunities that could help both users and transit authorities. Jean-Sébastien, let's start with you. How do you see digital technologies helping to improve things, particularly for neighborhoods and populations that are underserved by regular public transit?
Yes, I think for decision makers, people who are making decisions about how to organize, a transit system, we have a huge potential in terms of new data being available, and in order to better understand from a geospatial perspective, who are the users, and then what is the demographic composition of certain areas. And also it helps us with the modeling. And with the modeling, what you can do is have some scenarios and then see actually, who can benefit from one route versus the others, and then also identify pockets of underserved population, depending on the criteria that you use. So I'd say just, that modeling capacity based on geomapping is really a new area that I see in the coming years is going to be more used by each level of government in order to better understand who uses transit and how can we improve the efficiency of our transit systems.
So it could really, digital technologies or having some app-based, it could help gathering the data that governments need to improve the systems. Is that one of the things you're talking about?
Yes, and there are different sources of data. It can come from, the aggregation of personal data. And, we all know that there are some very important privacy issues related to that. So there's a governance, there needs to be a discussion around, how do we use those those sets of data, and whose responsibility it is to, if there is an issue, a breach of privacy, a breach of security, those are really important considerations. Having said that, the potential is actually there.
Catherine, how can we leverage smartphones and apps to improve the experience of transit users? Is there a potential for us to boost ridership?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think, I just want to refer back to a Globe and Mail article that I think a few of us read about a month ago, 3-4 weeks ago. And, it was just talking about, transit apps and how they're used. But, some cities have used them very, very well, not just in a kind of, your bus might be here in 10 minutes. It's like, your bus is actually 14 minutes away. Here it is. You can watch it come. And, you can pay with your phone. You don't have to, go looking for your Presto pass or whatever pass it is you're using. And I remember there was this one scenario where a dad was taking his kid somewhere and he knew he had 16 minutes. So instead of guessing and standing at the stop for 15 and a half minutes with a potentially cranky child, he, stopped at the store, stopped at the park, and then, 2 minutes out, wandered over to the bus and got on. I think that we would all take transit. I know I would. So, when we think about, train systems and transit systems, if you can walk out and it's coming, you're just much more likely to take it than if you think, I'm going to go, it should be here, but it may not be. And, it only takes once for your bus not to show up for about 30 minutes or 20 minutes or 40. And if you have other options, you will take them. Like that's the key point, right? So absolutely. But, your apps really depend on a good, reliable, functioning transit system at the same time. But it also, I think, will lead us to using more things like microtransit, where you have transit on demand for some neighborhoods that are underserved today, where we can help with that first and last mile, whether it's, an e-scooter or e-bikes. There's just so much potential to unlocking that, because I think that if transit is really affordable and really reliable and is connected, why wouldn't you take it, right? Like people would, yeah.
I know, particularly in the climate here in Ottawa, in the winter, it would certainly be appreciated to have certainty that when you need to leave your warm environment to go out and wait at the stop would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Shauna, the post-pandemic shift to work from home has really changed commuting patterns. And the shift to electrified transit will add new complications in terms of needing to charge buses. Do you see potential for digital technologies to help transit systems adjust?
Yes, and I think we already see the benefits of using digitization and digital tech to help us in this sort of post-pandemic period. So many transit systems in Canadian cities now are actually seeing that recovery on weekends is stronger than recovery during the week, that they've sort of exceeded. So there's this sense of a shifting emphasis on traveling for cultural and recreational activities, changes in rush hour activity, right? So this idea around what time does one commute? Do we still have a rush hour, between 7 and 9 and 4 and 6? Or is it more spread out throughout the day because of hybrid work and greater flexibility? And so our transit systems actually need to leverage the technology they already have to collect data and to use that data both carefully, but also to improve the opportunity to improve their service, right? Catherine talked about, the answer isn't to reduce service. The answer is to maybe modify service, to adjust service, and you can adjust service much more clearly and in more real time if you're actually collecting the data on that. The other thing around sort of thinking about how to serve a range of communities, a range of people using mobility. I mean, mobility is sort of like the source of all activities that you do in your life. You have to be able to move around. You have to be able to, if you're working, if you want to have a job, you need to be able to get there. If you can't get to a job, or if you can't get to a whole, a particular area, then all the jobs in that location are actually off limits to you. So we know that improving accessibility, improving service, improving affordability actually creates an economic imperative for people, and this is really important. So when we're thinking about the cost of investing in the infrastructure, we also need to take into account what is the cost of not investing in that infrastructure. But I want to raise the example of Belleville, Ontario. Belleville is a smaller city. It has a bus system. It never had night bus service. And a couple of years ago, they introduced on-demand night buses in Belleville. They addressed the challenge of, well, what if you didn't have a phone and you couldn't order? So on-demand busing is essentially the same software, the same algorithm that a ride-hailing firm would use, but instead it applies it to the bus. The bus doesn't have a fixed route. The route changes depending on which passengers need the bus and where they're going. And a study, so they implemented this before COVID, and actually it opened up all kinds of opportunities for people to take jobs, for students to get to school, for families to get their groceries and to access recreational opportunities. And it worked well because there wasn't enough demand for a fixed route bus, but there was enough demand for the on-demand bus. And actually during COVID, when ridership plummeted, all buses in Belleville switched to this on-demand platform in order to be more efficient, more accessible. And I note in the report there are a couple of other examples there too. The other thing I'll say, thinking about the technology piece and how do we leverage the technology, another example of leveraging technology for providing greater or even some public transit service in a smaller place is the example of the the town of Innisfil near Barrie, Ontario, and their partnership, their contract with Uber. And instead of launching their own public bus system, they contracted with Uber to provide rides to people. And it was a fixed number of rides people could take. And what they found is it was a great success. People who used the system really enjoyed it. But it cost way more money than the city had budgeted because people were using it so much. And so you came to rely on it to get to your work, to get groceries, to get where you needed to be, to get to appointments. And then they had to scale back because they didn't have sufficient budget. And so it's something, on the one hand, it was innovative, it was a good test. I believe they're still using it, but the service no longer provides the same affordability or accessibility as it did in the past. And I know I haven't answered your electric bus charging question, but maybe...
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
And it's not something I have a huge amount of insight on. But again, this is where digital technologies can help, right? That you can have an algorithm, you can have a system that tells you this is when you're going to have to charge this bus, and you can, an electric bus and a bus that has, that operates on a number of routes. You need to have obviously some surplus, some redundancy in your system, both in your network, but also in your infrastructure. And then you can plan out times for charging. And also as we invest in more charging stations, not just for buses, but for all vehicles, but it is something that then we can sort of put it into the plan. So yes, it requires stopping and charging for a period, but also digital technologies actually will enable that to be easier, to be more efficient.
Great. So, Shauna, you got a little bit into some of the barriers in adopting some of these technologies, but Jean-Sébastien, what do you see as some other barriers that transit authorities face in adopting digital technologies?
Yes, and maybe I can just build on the idea that transit agencies across the country are actually experimenting. Like there are a lot of examples of local on-demand services that are linked with regular services, and I think we are in a period where people are looking at what's working, what's not working, and what are the models that actually make sense. Going back to the question of the barriers, I'd say maybe if we look at electrification just as an example, one of the things is the risks that are associated with taking one technology over another. For example, for many transit agencies, like it is a huge investment, and then there is the impact of path dependency. Like once you've made that investment, it's hard to go back. And given the fact that some of the technologies are still evolving, sometimes also there are risks associated with some technologies not necessarily working as advertised. That happens when you actually test the different technologies, and looking at, for electrification, you have battery electric, you also have hydrogen, you have a whole series of different technologies. Knowing which one works for which system can be something that is quite a challenge. So I'd say the risk associated with choosing one technology is one potential barrier for the transit agencies.
Oh, for sure. Catherine, what do you see as some of the barriers in decision-making at the municipal level in particular? The Cowan-Thomas paper talks about building equity considerations into planning and project decisions. Why do you think that's not happening now? And are we measuring success in the right ways?
Well, transit systems in municipalities are cash-starved. I mean, municipalities are cash-starved. And so, when we think about how we've to date planned our transit systems, the decisions have been made around revenue generation. And that doesn't mean that, as Shauna said, like we can offer a service that we don't want to offer a service and then have to scale back, but we do have to measure the success of our transit system by who it's serving and how it's serving people, and whether they feel safe on our transit system, whether they feel that it's serving them in an equitable way. If you're a single parent and it's taking you an hour and a half, an hour and 50 minutes to get home, that's not equitable. But also when we think about municipalities and decision making, oftentimes the louder voices get the services over others, and those others are often lower income neighborhoods that maybe aren't as organized as some of other neighborhoods in the city. So they do get underserved, and it's not based on a rational, even economic basis. Like when you think about how you plan, for transit, for example, and to have more transit in a denser area, and then to have, as we build out what that, to have, if you just think about like a light rail system, for example, it probably shouldn't go all the way to Barrhaven South. Like it probably should have, and there was actually a paper in Ottawa that was prepared back in the 80s that said like any rail system should be within the Greenbelt. And after that, you have bus rapid transit, you have other ways of moving people around. And we ignored that, and to our detriment. It's more expensive and it doesn't serve people. And that's not to choose one community over another, but just to make sure that everyone is getting that equitable amount of rapid transit. So often, it is being done, municipal politicians do listen to the people they represent, but if you think about the city as a whole and consider the city as a whole, not think out in like 4-year terms, I think we can make much better decisions for how we serve people on transit.
Sure. Shauna, what do you think is holding governments back from adopting innovations that could improve urban transportation?
It's a great question. I think one of the things holding governments back is actually a fear of failure, that there are so many times when we say, we need to experiment and we also need to be willing to fail, right? The great motto for serial entrepreneurs is that you have to fail a lot of times before you succeed. And yet we don't seem to apply that in the same way to how we test out new things in cities, or we generate a narrative that suggests an experiment is unfair. it's not good for people, it's not good for the city, why are you experimenting in this way? But I would suggest that we actually need to flip that and to say we need to be willing to test these out. We need to be willing to test out new technologies. We need to be willing to test out new ways of moving around, right? And so one example is e-scooters. And I don't know, how many of you have ever ridden an e-scooter? Oh, that's about a third or fourth of the, not a third, maybe a fourth or fifth of them. I rode an e-scooter once in LA. I thought I was going to, I rode it 3 times. My husband really liked the e-scooters. He kept wanting to go on them, and every time I was like, I'm not dead yet. And I've never ridden one again. But the thing about e-scooters, right, I mean, they're not for everyone. A lot of cities are petrified of them. First of all, there's the speed issue. There's the issue that the time you're most likely to have an accident, and even a fatal accident on an e-scooter, is actually the very first time you ride it, and that's a pretty scary statistic. And they clutter up the sidewalks if you don't have proper parking, and people trip on them, and they cause an accessibility concern, especially for people who are either mobility impaired or visually impaired, right? So huge challenge to get those e-scooters. In Toronto, they said there's no way. We're not having e-scooters. We're not even trying it out. In Montreal, they said we're going to try it out. In lots of Canadian cities, they said we're going to try it out. Montreal found that it was very hard to enforce, and so they took them away. And I think this is a really great example of we tried it, and there were some challenges, and we removed it rather than saying, nope, we're not even going to try, right? Because first of all, you can control the speed. You can geofence. You can say you're not allowed to take your e-scooter over here. So in LA, however many years ago, we tried to take our e-scooters to this very lovely neighborhood, and they just stopped moving. So you couldn't take it there, right? You can require a helmet, and I've been to places where there's a helmet attached to each e-scooter, and you can create the infrastructure for e-scooters to operate safely on the street. But so I think it's a really nice example of governments need to try. Right? Same thing with on-demand ride-hailing, same thing with just changing the size of the bus in order to create efficiencies that way and to be able to provide services to more places, using data to understand how to reorient schedules, systems, approaches, and try these things out. And we have the ability to test, to analyze, to see what works, and to actually say no at some point. Recently, someone said, it's not a strategy if you say yes to everything. And that really resonated. But again, don't say yes to everything, but say yes to some things and make an effort to try them and then evaluate.
Thank you for that. So we have about 5 minutes before we're going to be opening things up for questions from the audience. But I have time for maybe one more question for each of you. And Catherine, I'd really like to get your view on how can governments convince people that transit-oriented, high-density communities are desirable? Will people vote for them?
Well, you know what, I say build it and they'll come, first off. You know, again, I go back to, if you ask people, you know, where would you like to go visit today? Like which city and what would you like to do? Most people will say, and you know, urban, dense, transit-oriented space, right? So we just haven't done that in many of our cities. We have a lot of space. You know, I take a city like Ottawa, we have a lot of space, so we really have only built high rises or built out into greenfield. You know, but then you know we throw our transit system out into a greenfield community, and then we build or we allow massive parking lots to be there as well, right? So, you know, we're always kind of not shooting ourselves in the foot, but you can't continue to build transit and then build roads and widen roads beside that transit. You have to at some point, you know, pull back, and it's not a one versus the other. I have a car, I drive, I make decisions on how and when that's going to happen. But you know, if you think about a neighborhood where when you age out of your home, you can stay in that neighborhood because we built the type of housing for everyone, where your kids might be able to live down the street if that's what you want. It's not for everyone, but you know, those are the types of neighborhoods. Like, you know, we know that 70% of people don't want to live in dense high rises. So where do they want to live? I don't believe that 70% of people necessarily want to live far outside of a downtown core, but maybe they're, by building in communities where we have the option to build gentler density communities that are walkable, that are transit serviceable, certainly will attract people.
Jean-Sébastien, I want to talk about funding as well, because it's something that comes up a lot. And, in terms of the federal role for funding, where do you see that sort of moving in terms of the permanent public transit fund and others in terms of supporting the infrastructure and digital technology experimentation?
So I'd say, and that will not be news, like there is a strong focus right now on housing as a priority for the federal government. And given the linkages with transit, I'd say one of the priority is really to make sure that, the transit investments are actually being aligned with the plans regarding housing, and making sure that there is a consideration of what are the density requirements around transit corridors, around transit stations. So that's one of the key elements. Like if we look at the vision for transit funding going forward, I'd say the fact that the commitment was, it's seen as a permanent source of fund, that provides an opportunity to look over the long term and actually look at what are the longer term plans for communities. And that's a big opportunity for integrated planning, where you look at the land use, where you look at the climate impact, and then look at your portfolio of projects as your capital investment, and what are the results that you're going to expect from those investments. So that's also, I'd say, part of the vision of the current government. So.
Great, thank you. Shauna, the last question goes to you. One of the challenges seems to be that some public transit systems are publicly funded, but then you want to integrate it with a lot of these privately run services, whether it's scooters or bikes or Uber. How can governments help to support sort of smoother integration across those things?
Well, a couple of ways, and actually just to build on Jean-Sébastien's point around what the federal government can do in terms of leveraging through infrastructure investments. You can also think about the opportunities for governments to use their levers to encourage a range of mobility services connected to public transit, right? And so you might see governments take this upon themselves, as in some of the sort of mobility as a service apps. Mobility as a service is essentially an app that you get on your phone, I guess, that will connect all kinds of forms of mobility. So public transit, bike share, e-scooter, car share. There are some places, particularly in Europe, in Berlin, in Hamburg, where the municipal government actually has taken this role upon themselves, right? To say, as a government, we're going to say this is a priority. We want people to use transit, and we also want to make it easier and more seamless for them to move around in a number of ways that don't involve their own private automobile. And so municipal governments doing this work of creating the mobility as a service app, and then even connecting with other providers is one. Also thinking about connecting and tying in other forms of sort of active transportation with transit stations. I went to Taipei several years ago, and if you have a subway ticket in Taipei, you get off the subway, and there is a group of bikes, locked up like a bike share, and your subway ticket also gets you the bike, and you can ride the bike to the next place. And so, again, this is a way that you can encourage both the use of transportation of public transit, but also the sort of a seamless opportunity to move about. We start to see that even more now in Canadian cities with not necessarily a connected ticket, but at least the connection between getting off the transit station and seeing the bike share right next to it. And so I think there are some different ways. And again, as I started talking about, the levers that the federal government has in terms of infrastructure funds, that you could require that in order to take up an investment to build a transit station, that you also have to agree that you're going to put these other sort of last mile services connected to that.
Great, thank you. So I think we're ready for questions. There's 2 microphones here. We have one here. Claire, maybe do you want to start with an online question?
Sure. I will just ask a quick question from the Zoom, where we've got over 50 people joining us online. David Chant asks a nice straightforward question. How can digital tech move us from a car-centric society to a more sustainable mindset?
Who wants to take that? Shauna, do you want to start?
That's a nice, clean question because it's short, but it's also hard. How can digital tech take us from car-centric to more sustainable? I mean, I think we sort of touched on, as a panel, some of those already around using digital technology to make it more seamless, to make it easier and more accessible to use public transit. But and I guess the other piece of that is, how do you get people out of their cars? It's both a carrot and a stick, right? The carrot is you give some kind of incentives. You make it easier to use transit and to use those things using digital technology. Well, I'm trying to think, what's the stick piece, right? Like, how do you also encourage, part of it, is the congestion, right? Maybe you take away the app's ability to tell someone that they're going to be stuck in traffic for an hour. That certainly wouldn't be a popular move, but it's something you could do. Sorry, tell us. But certainly you could think about, is there a way to encourage with the digital tech? Is there a way to create an incentive to get people out of their cars that's very sort of car specific, either through actually encouraging more congestion, right? Congestion by itself is not a terrible thing. If you think about a city and all of the activity happening at the street when you're in a congested area, you actually get to appreciate some of that a bit more. But by enabling through technology better transit, if the car experience is worse, you're going to, I guess, achieve that as well.
Catherine, maybe you can respond to that as well. More pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly places tend to be less car-friendly, right?
Yes, I mean, I just want to pick up on something reminding me when Shauna was speaking. I remember when I was on city council, the bike community, cycling community would have like a let's ride our bike to work day or week. And I used to think, well, let's encourage everyone to drive their car for a day. Everybody, off of the bus, off your bike, no walking, everybody in your car and come on downtown. And then we'll see what happens, right? So I'd be the only one at work that day, because I could walk there or I might be able to drive there quickly. But the reality is there's just so much space, and there's only so much space, and it's public space. So from building to building, that is public space that needs to be shared. And when we think about, people needing to walk their kids to school or just going to a shopping experience, you're going to walk where it is pleasant and where it is safe. So you're going to, So when you and by that is pedestrian congestion and cycling congestion, those are the types of places that you want to be in. So when we talk to our small business community, people on our main streets, businesses on our main streets, we're starting to make that shift in how they think about how people get to their businesses. At one time in Ottawa, you pretty much had to go to Preston Street to get great pasta. Now, apparently, the best pasta place is in Barhaven. So, you don't have to come to Preston anymore. Businesses are starting to think about themselves as community entities and amenities rather than just destinations. I don't know if I answered your question, but I really want to get that drive into work thing. Yeah, thanks.
We'll go here in the mic.
Hi, my name is Mary Huang. I'm part of Centertown Community Association and Ottawa Community Benefits Network. I have lived for 10 years in Europe, London, Paris, and Prague. So I really love livable cities with that transit friendly and so on. I'm a huge fan of the Vienna and Singapore, which have master planned communities near transit with housing or affordable housing and other services, essentially creating 15-minute neighborhoods in transit friendly. And I'm not seeing as much of that in Canada, and especially in Ottawa. So what I would like all the panelists to comment on, how can we move towards that type of a model where we're planning things instead of being siloed in a more master planned, integrated fashion of transit with housing, affordable housing, facilities, activities, education, childcare, senior care, everything together. Thank you.
Jean-Sébastien, why don't we start with you? Do you think Canada could get to that level?
That's a good question, and I'd say, each community have different history, how they were built as well. I don't think, if we think about Winnipeg or Quebec City, is the model to have something that would be similar to Singapore? I'm not sure that this is what we would, be hoping for. At the same time, there are opportunities for, better densification, transit-oriented communities, and sometimes, we think density is only about housing, but it's more than that. We need to think about green spaces as well. There are services, making sure that those are accessible to the community. So I think you have a variety of models out there, and we need to make sure that we consider them. So, yes, I'd say there is probably areas in Canada where more dense transit-oriented communities could be developed, but it might not be everywhere.
And Catherine, maybe you can respond to this master plan idea. Is that something in your experience that is possible?
Oh, yeah, absolutely it is. Hi, Mary. So, I think that when you think about transit-oriented development, community benefits, every piece that needs to go into a complete community that is centered around your transit, whether it's your rail transit or your bus rapid transit. The best models that I've seen, and the best model that we're building here in this city, is started with publicly owned land. So we've got in Ottawa, our housing provider, our community housing provider, Ottawa Community Housing, purchased land around what's going to be a new transit station. City purchased the rest of it, so we've got 14 acres. That some of it will definitely be sold off to private interests, but we cannot count on private developers to provide affordable housing. We just can't. I know people think about inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning just doesn't work. It's not worked anywhere. It doesn't provide the deep affordability forever, which is what we need. And developers just won't build around transit stations if we say to them, well, you have to hand over 10% of your units to be deeply affordable. So it has to start with publicly funded land, housing, community amenities, community benefits, and that can be done in a way that is affordable, and it can be mixed income, mixed use. Think about kids growing up in that type of neighborhood. One might be a lower income, one might be a much higher income, but they're going to the same school, they're shopping at the same stores, they're going to get maybe a part-time job when they're 16 at the same place. Just that you just really are building equity into the entire neighborhood, and throw in long-term care so that people can stay in their community at the end of it, right? So, and green space is hugely important, but it doesn't have to be volume. It needs to be quality green space and community space and what that looks like. So, yes, it absolutely can be done. It's quite exciting to think about how it's going to be done. Corsa Italia Station off Gladstone. Talk to me in 10 years, you'll see it'll all be there.
Shauna, any response to that before we go to our next question?
I agree, it can be done. I agree, in Canada, we have our cities have a very different history. Most of our urban growth right now is not taking place in the city core, but what's being called as sort of urban spread. And we've allowed this to go on for so long. And so to compare ourselves to a place like, to compare Canadian cities writ large to places like Singapore, which has an entirely different government structure and set of priorities around both public and private spaces, or even Paris, which in some ways, we're more like in terms of governance, and yet they have invested for, not just over fits and starts, but very seriously and deeply into public housing and government-generated housing. And we actually abandoned government-funded housing for decades, and we're just starting to now recognize that actually if we want to have affordable housing in our cities, our governments need to play a part again.
Great. Let's go to our next question.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Renal Marchand. I'm the co-chair of the Transportation Committee for the Council on Aging of Ottawa. I did use my BuzzBuddy app to come down here today, and it does tell me how far the bus is and when to leave my house. My question is going to be about rural Ottawa. We do know that 80% of our land here in Ottawa is rural, but only 10% of the people live in that area. And with amalgamations, many of their services got centralized here and is no longer over there. So some of the seniors may be able to drive, but to come into these congested areas, they're not comfortable with that. But public transit to them is few and far between. Sometimes there might be a morning bus and an evening bus, and that's about it. And the cost to them is a lot higher than it is for me, because I'm only about an hour by bus here. So how do we meet that challenge of these people? Because Ottawa says they want to be inclusive, they want to provide equity, but that's a lot of land.
And I think we can apply that question to a number of cities or even smaller communities, because certainly that lack of density is a challenge for making public transportation work. Jean-Sébastien, you want to talk a little bit about what we need to do in those lower density communities?
So I don't necessarily have like the solution in the context of the Ottawa region. At the same time, we need to have some smaller scale solutions where the transit that probably looks like on-demand transit, where you have a smaller scale of assets. We're thinking, minibus that are accessible, for example, and then, coupled with the potential of technology and apps, like, how can we make that work? And I think that's probably what future of rural areas is looking like when it comes to transit. It's not going to be like a perfect solution either, but if we're looking at the public transit in the context of a rural area, we're going to probably need to look at specific solutions that are adapted to the rural context.
I like that, but currently the Ottawa Transportation Master Plan for rural area, the only real investment is going to be in cycling lane. And I do own the e-bicycle, but if I ride it from one of the village to here, I'm probably not going to make it back home. So there's really a need, and I like what you just said about sort of on-demand or smaller buses that can address that, because I mean, there is the seniors, of course, and those, but with COVID, a lot of people move to the outside area, and there's not a lot of services for the transit, and it's a lot costlier. So thank you very much.
Catherine, maybe you can respond to that quickly. Just, do you see on-demand transit integrating into a city like Ottawa's transit system?
So absolutely, I see a place for it. I mean, Ottawa is actually unique. I think you can fit 5 cities. I'm going to maybe not remember them all into our geography. You can fit Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Montreal, and one other city into our landmass, right? So it is unique in that way. And yeah, if you're living out in Greeley, you're not. I don't think there's cycling infrastructure to get you into the city, but hopefully there's cycling infrastructure to get you around a village that you live close by, right? Like Manotick. You know, we have our rural communities are a hybrid of village and more rural areas. So, you know, there's, in the short term, whether it's, you know, park and rides at transit places, because of course people may not feel comfortable driving into a downtown core, but if you can get to, you know, the end of the line and then get in, it's certainly a way. But, you know, also, you know, in Manotick, in Greeley, in Richmond, you know, people are starting to look at their communities also as you know, complete communities. And what do we need to do to make sure that we maintain the character of our villages and we have the services that people need within those villages? Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's go to another question. Clay, do we have one online as well? Okay, great.
My name is Alex Long, and I did appreciate the comment just about other cities, because I spent the last year and a half looking at urban planning issues in the UK and London, and you know, they've got a completely different context. There you've got net zero targets by 2030, you've got a whole policy context that's driving a certain form of very holistic way at looking, mainstreaming climate considerations, you know, the built form, built environment. Here in Canada, we don't really seem to have that driver at a local level. So I guess I would ask kind of the panel, without kind of clear, say, cities need to be net zero ready by 2030, you need to have built-in adaptive capacity. You know, I look at Toronto and you've got the new relief line that's going to go through to Ontario Place. Well, that was designed at a time when there were still commuters going downtown. That's not needed anymore. So you've got a lot of sunk costs and expensive infrastructure going downtown. But it was fascinating here in Mississauga, your ridership is back up to a level because people are getting around by transit. So I guess when I wonder in Canadian cities, this broader question around climate readiness, around adaptive capacity, you know, are there drivers that are really going to push these questions around digitization, around transportation to get to the place they need to get to? Without that, are we just kind of scrambling? And so do you see on the horizon kind of something that's going to make our cities, make transit, take advantage of these, I'd say these digital potential around technologies and transportation? Or is it going to be, which is fine, the apps that have a decent user face that people can ride their scooter if they want to and things like that?
Shauna, why don't you start us off on that one?
Well, since I know Alex, I'm going to say that I disagree on the notion that the relief line maybe isn't needed anymore, because you're right, it was meant to serve as relief for commuter traffic on the congested sort of Yonge University line, and at the same time, it is needed because not only was it would it have served commuters, which we still have at least on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future of the office, but we also have hundreds of thousands, if not more, new residents and residents living in proximity to those lines. And the reason why transit works so well in London is actually because of the redundancy of lines. So you probably were there when the Elizabeth line opened, which was billions of dollars over budget, many years late, just like transit projects in Canada and everywhere else for that matter. And there were big concerns, should they have put all this money into this Elizabeth line when nobody's going anywhere anymore? And actually all, ridership targets were exceeded.
But that was a cross-city form of transportation versus just directing people downtown.
But you could argue that the relief line is not just going downtown, it's going in a bit of a U.
Ontario Place, yeah.
So much of this is about predicting the future, right? It's
Yes.
about predicting how are people going to live, how are they going to travel, where are they going to go. Catherine, what do you think about that?
Well, I also think that we forget about bus rapid transit often when we're thinking about our transit systems. And in cities, take a city like Ottawa, for example, like Carling should have bus rapid transit. It's this big, wide roadway that's actually under capacity. That's actually, there's also not many cars on it. It's so wide, doesn't look like there are anyway. But, you know, to have cycling lanes and have bus rapid transit, it's part of our plans. It was supposed to be put in place about 8 years ago and just kind of gets shelved. But that is also where we need to be building, you know, housing along those baseline road and just connecting people, whether it's into the downtown if they're still working in the downtown, whether it's into another community, into Canada if that, you know, we have a strong high-tech you know, sector in Canada. So, you know, we have to think also about bus rapid transit and where we connect people to all of our transit systems. I'll say this about transit. I don't know that, you know, it'd be hard pressed to convince me that any line within the green belt would be not used well and that you couldn't build a lot of housing around it. Yeah, but you have to do both. Yeah.
Right. Well, we're at time, but I'd like to extend thank you and please a round of applause for our excellent panelists. Thanks as well for being here. So I want to thank our sponsor for the event, TELUS, and Joe Roselle's here with us today. And I would also like to thank the IRPP staff who helped make this event happen. Here with us today are our President and CEO, Jennifer Ditchburn, our event planner, Blair Elliott, and our Communications Director, Clea Desjardins, as well as Research Associate, Abigail Jackson. But there are also several others from the IRPP behind the scenes that helped with both the event and publication. And thank you to those on Zoom for joining us. For those in the room, we do have lunch after the event. Look forward to chatting with you as we finish up. Thanks so much.